that the parashat Stuma means there's a certain blockage being mentioned here, whether it was the hearts and eyes of the Jewish people. Once Yaakov died, there was a spiritual decline, the beginning of the spiritual exile, which eventually descended into physical exile. That already began with Yaakov's departing, and that caused the blockage or the lack of wide consciousness, which would be described in space in between the parasha. The fact there's no space describes a certain limitation, like the Mitzrayim, the constriction of Mitzrayim. That's the Rashi and the Midrash. Or the fact that Yaakov's knowledge of the end of days was removed from him, and his consciousness was his stream of consciousness was blocked. But Rav Moshe says these are all nice midrashim, which obviously they're very deep. But Rav Moshe says obviously there's the simple explanation of the fact that this is very clearly describing a continuation between last week's end of last week's parasha and the beginning of this week's parasha, clearly indicating that there is no break, there is no breakdown of narrative. It's a complete continuation of last week following into this week. So Rav Moshe is going to say, what is this describing? What's specific about this week's continuation of last week that we would therefore not have the break? Says Rav Moshe, question number 2. Now let's actually go, says Rav Moshe, into the events described in the previous parasha, which we're now saying seemingly is a continuation. We are continuing from that. It says in the last parasha, Vayechi Israel be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen, and Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. Pasuk hazeh, however, in this parasha begins, and Yaakov lived in the land of Egypt. It doesn't doesn't feel it's necessary to specify that we're talking about the Goshen province of Mitzrayim. We just say the land of Egypt. So what's the difference between the end of last parasha and this parasha? Then we have question number 3. Ma tzorech b'pasuk hakodem lahodienu ki he'achzu ba. The pasuk says, last week's parasha finishes off, the Israelites, or Yaakov and his family, Israel and his family, settled in the land of Egypt, in the area of Goshen, Vayechi ba, and they held on to it, meaning they inherited it, they made it theirs. Why is that an important, necessary step describing their dwelling in that area? Number 4, Lama piret chaya be'eretz Mitzrayim. Velama lo piret ma shechaya b'chol echad memkomot asher gar sham. Why does the Torah only talk about the amount of time he lived in Egypt, and we don't describe how many years he lived in all the other places he lived? Number 5, כי אחר שהאסוד עתיד לכלול כל סך ימיו, יאמר בתחילה ויחי יעקב 7 שנים, ולא יפרט klal. So why does it have to mention the fact that he lived in Egypt for 17 years? It seems to be that if you would just say that he lived a total of 147 years, we would be able to deduct the fact that 17 years of those were in Mitzrayim, because last week's parasha, he mentions to Paro that he's 130. So if you do a little bit of first grade maths, you would see that would end up being 17 years in Egypt. Number 6, כי אומרו ימי יעקב הוא מיותר. והיה ראוי לומר ויהי שני חייו. So the pasuk starts off Vayechi Yaakov. We know we're talking about Yaakov. And then it says Vayehi Yemei Yaakov. The days of Jacob, Shnei Chayav, the years of his life. Why is it important to mention? It seems very superfluous. Vayehi Yemei Yaakov. Shnei Chayav. It should just say the years of his life, 147. What's the days of Yaakov? The years of his life. Number 6, ki omra Yemei Yaakov miyutar, as we just said. Number 7, omra vayehi ki ma'hara'ui omar vayiyu. So here we're talking about the years of Jacob, which is plural, many years. It says vayehi, and it was the years. It doesn't say and they were the total of it says and it, and that seems to be talking about 1 year, not 147 years. Says the Rav Moshe as follows. Now, in order to understand what's going on here, we're going to go back to the last time Yaakov Avinu's age was mentioned, which is in last week's parashat, while he is being introduced to Paro. Paro asked Yaakov how old he was. And what was Yaakov's response? The years of my dwelling, shlashim u'ma'at shana, was as 130 years. And then he says, Ma'at v'ra'im hayu, my days were little in number and bad in nature. So says the Rav Moshe, this seems very strange. Why is Yaakov getting so grumbly? If you get 130 years of life, you should be very happy about that. You should accept it with grace. Why is he being seeming to be such a complainer with his years? Number 2, he says, "V'gam omra v'lo hisigu." My years haven't reached, he continued saying, the years of my fathers, Yaakov and Yitzchak and Avram. So what does it mean your years haven't reached? They also were 130 at some point, and then they became older. How does he know that he's not going to live up to their ripe old age? Mihi gidlo shelo yichya ad yasig lemeavutav. Number 3, Gam ma ele shinu adashon pam shnei chayim upam shnei megurim. He starts off saying, the years of my dwelling, megurai, like lashon of ger. And then he says, ma'at v'ra'im ayu yemei shnei chayai, the years of my life. So what's the difference between the years of my life and the years of my dwelling? Gam omra b'mei megurahem hu miyutar. It says that my years didn't reach the years of my fathers in their dwelling. So what's going on here? So this obviously, Yaakov isn't just saying a simple complaint. We have to now understand what he's saying, because Yaakov is a wise man, and he's meeting, the leader of the not so free world at the time, and he's telling him something. So what is he telling him? Achine amru rabbeinu zal al pasuk ki orech yamim ushnot chaim. This is a Gemara in Yuma that says the following: there are days that are days of life. There are years that are called that can be considered shnot chaim. Ela mi shechayav b'shalva him shel chaim. If one has a life of serenity, of peace, that is considered life. Aval chayei tsar einam shel chaim. Years that a person goes through in suffering, in pain, is not considered years of life. It's considered years that he's alive, but it's not years of life. So therefore, with this introduction, we'll now understand what Yaakov is saying. Paro in his question asked him the following: Kama yemei shnei chayecha? How many of the days of your life, of your chayim? So Yaakov had to clarify, when you ask me how many years of life I had, that's not that many, because when I hear Yaakov's telling Paro, when I hear you asking how many years of life I had, that insinuates years of peace and serenity. Shemoreh al shnot chayim v'shalva. Anav Amar, so that Yaakov responded to that, Lo shnot chayim hayalu. Most of my years were not years of life. Ki im shel megurim. My life was a life of displacement. Gerut v'tiltul. I was always a foreigner. I was always moving from place to place, which really doesn't have the quality of life that you would have in a life of peace and stability. V'zeu shloshim u'ma'at shana. Hayu yemei shnai megurai. 130 years I have lived, years of dwelling. Megurai, like gerim. Shema tomar hayitachen sheben shnei megurim lo hayu k'tzat shnot chayim. So you're telling me that out of all the 130 years, there was only suffering and displacement, there was no years of stability at all? L'zeh amar da'efo ki ma'at v'ra'im hayu asher yikaru shnot chayim. So even the years that I wasn't being displaced, even the years that I was able to be settled in a place for a period of time, first of all, those years were very few. And second of all, those years, even though they were stable, they weren't necessarily peaceful in terms of the events that I went through and the states of mind that I had to be subject to during those years. So that's what he's saying. Ma'at v'ra'im hayu yemei shnei chayai. Even those years of serenity weren't really many, and they weren't very peaceful at all altogether. There was always some kind of negative things happening to him during these years. So you're telling me, okay, what's the big deal? You're not the first person in your family to go through displacement and trials and tribulations. Avraham and Yitzchak also had to go around and travel and go through suffering with different things they went through. So why are you making such a big fuss out of your life? He's saying my fathers also went through some stuff, but their years of serenity, at least when they did have peaceful lives, they had some periods of serenity. However, mine were very, very few and far between, and even then they weren't that good to begin with. Periodically, in between the years of displacement, they had a few years of stability. However, me in my bitter state, even the few years that I did have a bit of stability, I had way less and way fewer years of stability. So now that we understand Yaakov's life and the patterns of his experiences in his world, Yaakov had a life. Vayechi is insinuating years of life. Which period in his life can you refer to as years of life? Yaakov only had 17 years that he lived that you could refer to them as years of life. Vayechi. These are years that you could say that he lived. So now Rav Moshe is going to tell us a very interesting thing. It's like people say that the entire meal is really depending on how the dessert was. Because if you have an entire meal that's not mediocre food, but if the dessert was good, you go home with a good flavor and a good taste in your mouth, and that was a good meal. So he says the same is true with a person's life. If a person would have a great life, with success and everything he wants, the last few years of his life was very bitter, till he's died in his deathbed, he's been suffering for the last period of his life. It's as if the first section of his life that was successful is non-existent. In his mindset, he'll feel like his life was a life filled with suffering. And the same is true the other way around. If a person would live a difficult life his whole life, however, the last period of his life is positive and happy, and he'll die peacefully and happily in good old age, then that will change the entire perspective. With a few years of good, he'll forget his entire suffering. That will now reframe his entire life as one unified positive experience. So even though we learned in last week's parashat that Yaakov referred to his life as years of displacement and suffering, and even the years that were stable, there were so few and far between that they didn't even count. But now we're saying you should know that the last 17 years, Vayechi Yaakov, 17 years Yaakov did have life-filled life. Years full of life and good. And therefore, this now reinterpreted and reframed his entire life. Now, this period caused Yaakov's entire life. Shnei Chayav. So before we had a question, why does it say the days of Yaakov and the years of his life? So now Rav Moshe is saying you have to understand the pasuk differently. That because he had 17 years of life, of good life, therefore Vayiyu Yemei Yaakov, the entire sum total of Yaakov's days, became Shnei Chayav, became life-filled years. Ki atu ka'ata kanu avaya chadasha. They have now been reacquired in a new way. They've been completely recalibrated into a new type of life perspective. V'nasu kulam shnot chayim. V'zehu vayehi yemei Yaakov shnei chayav. Why does it say in a singular way? Another question we asked. It doesn't say and they were. It says it was, to point out that now the way his life became reframed as positive was because they now were reacquired as one whole sum total of life. So ki achadim nechshavu kulam shnot chayim. The fact that they now come together as one is what makes them into good years. And this is actually a very interesting thing that the Zohar HaKadosh talks about, that the best years of Yaakov's life were in Mitzrayim, and there's different explanations as to why that is. How could you say that Yaakov's best years are in Chutz La'aretz? The Zohar HaKadosh talks about it, and different Sfarim. The Bat Ayin has a Torah, the Bav Sherebi, and the general gist of the tzaddikim that talk about this thing is that, as we know, that the best situations are brought out in times in places of challenge, in teams when we go into a place of tumah. That is when the biggest kedusha is able to be brought out, paradoxically. That's what the general idea of this is. But Rav Moshe is saying that actually on a physical level, he finally, he had his son with him. He wasn't being chased by by Esav. He wasn't being chased by the Shechem people. He wasn't being tricked by Lavan. He finally had a peaceful life. His son is the king of the land, giving him whatever he needs. He had royal protection, and it was a great retirement plan. You go to Egypt and live off of the king's coffers, being the son of the king. Yeah. So that was the. This is a bit shaky. So now Moshe continues as follows: V'hinei im hayu hu v'chol zaro b'mitzvayot ha-Mitzrayim hayu nechazim b'bakim b'tumat Mitzrayim. So here comes the potential problem. So you're right that the Mitzrayim was a beautiful place to live. It was peaceful, and it was prosperous for him. However, there's the spiritual aspect to be considered as well. And Egypt is the place of immense tumah. And if what would happen by the fact that they lived in Egypt would have affected him and his family, or at least his family, would have been affected by the impurity and the lack of kedusha that existed in Mitzrayim, then it wouldn't have been worth it. Yaakov's not looking to have a peaceful life materially if that's going to affect the holiness of his family. So that's why the Torah has to now address the fact whether the impurity of Egypt had an effect on Jacob's family. So he says as follows: if the Jewish people would actually have lived in Mitzrayim proper, then they would have to have been affected by the tumah of Mitzrayim, because as we know, every land has a spiritual energy, an angel, a ministering angel in heaven that is in charge or channels the energy of this country, of this land through him. And therefore anybody that's living in this place and living off the produce this place produces is going to have be affected by the energy of this angel. So if the Jewish people would have had to live in Mitzrayim proper, then it wouldn't have been worth it. However, they didn't live in Egypt. They lived in where? In Goshen. What was Goshen? Goshen was different. As we're going to see, Ramosh is going to introduce to us what was the story with Goshen. So let's see. So first of all, he says, if they would have to live in Mitzrayim, there would be two problems. First of all, they would have to live under the jurisdiction of the Sar of Mitzrayim, who was a very negative, God-opposing angel. Umagam kisham ikar chelat adamat mea. The physical land of Mitzrayim was also very, very impure. Ki alken ervat haaretz kra Hashem. Hashem calls Eretz Mitzrayim the erva of the Eretz Israel. We know that the erva is the impure state of sexual desires. We know that the Brit Kodesh, the most holy place of a human person, of a Jewish person's body, is the Brit Kodesh. So now Mitzrayim, who were their entire land was the impure version of the Brit Kodesh, which is the diametrically opposed version of a Jewish Brit. So they were the Ervat Haaretz. So it's like the most, the sin city of the world was Mitzrayim. So that was the worst place for a Jew to be. Yaakov's happiness would have been completely destroyed if this would have been the case, that the Jewish people had to live in Mitzrayim proper. It would be negative. All of this negative thing of being under the jurisdiction of this tumah would everything else would just pale in comparison compared to this level of failure, of disaster. So now Ramosh is going to explain to us why the parasha this week is connected and doesn't have any break between this parasha and the previous pasuk and the last parasha. Lechaber pasuk ze el pasuk shebesof parasha kodemet. This is in order to connect the end of that parasha to this parasha. V'hu kisham ne'emar Vayechi Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim. There it says that Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim, but not in Mitzrayim, in Eretz Goshen of Mitzrayim. And that is the introduction. We're going to see, Ramosh is going to get to in a minute. This is the introduction as to why Yaakov's life in Mitzrayim was considered years of good life, because his children didn't have to live in Mitzrayim, they lived in Goshen. So now Ramosh is first going to give us a little bit of a background, what Goshen was, how Goshen had this specific area. It was like a clean zone. It's like a quarantined, non-contaminated area that was allowed, that was perfect for the Jews. How did that come about to be? So the pasuk says, when Yosef introduced Mitzrayim to his father as an option to move to, he said, "You'll come to live in Mitzrayim, but don't you worry, you'll live in Goshen." So what's Goshen? What's specific about Goshen that is fine, that doesn't have the negative energy of Mitzrayim? Says Ramoshe, we would understand this based on the Pirkei de Rabbi Elazar. What does the Pirkei de Rabbi Elazar say? Ki Paro katav Eretz Goshen l'Sara b'ktuba. When Sarah was taken forcibly to be the wife of Paro, he wrote her a marriage contract in which he wrote to her that the land of Goshen is hers as an inheritance. So he gave her a whole province in Mitzrayim to belong to her. Now, even though he didn't end up marrying her because the Hashem made sure that didn't happen. So it seems to be that the gift of Goshen will now be cancelled. However, it did remain hers. He gave it to her, notwithstanding any conditions. He just gave it to her either way. So now the land of Goshen belonged to Sarah. So now, once it belongs to Sarah, וכל ניתנה לה והייתה שלה, על כן כוח הטומאה אשר חיפף עליה, נסתלק ממנה. The tumah that existed on this portion of land, as exists all over Mitzrayim, didn't exist in the Goshen. Goshen was now tumah free. Where do we see a similar concept? When Abraham acquired the field from Ephron, the pasuk says, and the Zohar explains, "Vayakam hasadeh," and the field was elevated. Ki alidei shekna'a Avraham, through Avram's acquisition of the land, Kima Haitala, it became elevated and it was lifted out of its current state of low energy, being belonging to Ephron. V'yitron l'makom, the place now received extra holiness. So the same is true with Goshen. Al ken shalach kazot el aviv lemor. This is what he meant when he suggested to Yaakov that he should live in Goshen. Al tachush imata v'zarecha tiyu mistafim tachatem ad Mitzrayim. I'm not suggesting that you come and live under the jurisdiction of the Egyptian rule. I'm telling you, v'yashavta be'eretz Goshen. Come live in Goshen. Ki en sham tuma. V'lo yatzarchem makom me'achad b'kedushat shorashei nafshotechem. You will still be able to be connected to the soul root that you are rooted in, even though you're in Egypt. So this Moshe here is hinting to a very deep thing, that every Jew, specifically holy Jews like the Shvatim and Yaakov Avinu, are rooted in a very spiritual place in Shamayim. But that can be blocked if they exist in an impure place physically. And we're going to see this also soon when Yaakov requests to be buried in Israel, that the place the person exists geographically has an effect on the ability of their soul to be connected in its place in heaven. And it's almost like you could say it's like, you know, you have like a cell phone jammer, you know, like it's the energy of Mitzrayim kind of blocks the frequency of the soul. But the Yosef is telling Yaakov, don't you worry, in Goshen you won't have that jam. The Jews lived in Mitzrayim. So this is the last pasuk of the last week's parashat. He said, don't you think that it was an issue when they lived in Mitzrayim? Why? Because it wasn't in the regular Mitzrayim, it was Be'eretz Goshen. They lived in Goshen, and therefore their connection to their soul in heaven, lo atzartam mileachez nafsham b'shorsham elyon. The energy in Goshen wasn't adversely affecting their ability to connect to their soul root in heaven. Ki im vayechzu ba. They were able to hold on and stay connected to their source in heaven. Ba'atzmam. Shehu b'shorsham hakadosh. So Ramosh is saying an interesting explanation on the last few words in the parasha last week. Vayechzu ba. What's the last 5 words in last week's parasha? They lived in Eretz Goshen, Vayechzu ba, and they held on to her. Vayifru vayirbu ma'od, and they multiplied, and they became fruitful. They multiplied greatly. So what is that saying? So Ramosha, this pasuk is describing the spiritual state of the Jews in Goshen, that their soul was able to hold on to its source in heaven, and just like Imayotam ba. So he's saying here that the way he's explaining the passage is as follows: Vayechzu, they were able to hold on to their personal connection in heaven, even though they were in the land of Goshen. Meaning the land of Goshen didn't affect their ability to hold on to their level of their soul. Or Yater Kipshuta, another version of understanding the same thing would be the way to put it into the words of the pasuk: Ki kol Yisrael yesh lem achiza be'eretz Yisrael l'kedushata. Every Jew has a portion in the land of Israel. Because the land of Israel is the place that every Jew naturally belongs in. And that's kind of the channel that we connect to heaven is through the land of Israel. Because the land of Israel is the physical manifestation of the physical world as it exists in the way it's supposed to be manifested in the ideal state. As it reflects heaven. So every Jew, that's the starting place, or the root of every Jewish person's soul is in that initial manifestation of the physical as it exists in the land of Israel, which is an elevated state of the physical. So what we're saying here is Vayechzu ba, that even though they were in Goshen, they still were able to hold on to the land of Israel. Because Goshen didn't prevent that. Whereas Mitzrayim would have been a blockage to be able to continue that level of connection. Vaharaya, what is the proof that the land of Goshen is spiritually non-adverse to holy connection? Vayifru vayirbu ma'od. The proof is in the pudding. That the Jewish people were able to multiply and grow both physically and spiritually, meaning their connection to above natureness wasn't affected. If they were actually now put under the jurisdiction of the minister of Egypt in heaven, if they were actually under the jurisdiction of the Egyptian minister, they would not be able to have unnatural growth, because they would be limited in the level of Shefa coming down through this angel. So from the fact that they grew exponentially, if we look into the Midrash, it says that the children were born 6 in one pregnancy, or even 60, some say. Right, the Midrash, very, very powerful Midrash, which needs to be understood, but is at least 60 is the highest number. There's actually Rabbi Akiva who says that there was 600,000. There was one woman in Egypt that gave birth to 600,000 in one go. And Rabbi Akiva says that, he says, oh, you know what I mean, I'm talking about Moshe's mother. And Moshe was equivalent in quality to 600,000 Jews. But here it seems like Rav Moshe is taking the understanding of 60 in one go to be literal. It could still be, he's not talking about literally, he's talking about the energy of birth, because birth is not only a physical thing. We know, for example, in the kavanot of prayers and of mitzvot, there's birth of new spiritual souls that happen through every mitzvah and every prayer. So birth isn't always referring to actual physical bodies. And it could be that in Mitzrayim, because they were doing so much birurim, right? Because we know, why did the Jews go to Egypt? Because there was lots of sparks, holy sparks, that needed to be elevated by just being there, and also by working there, etc. And because there was so much to do there in terms of collecting those sparks and perfecting them and doing the birurim and the sorting of the good from the bad, that every time we do a birur, it results in a new birth of spiritual energy coming forward into the souls of the people, into the souls of the world. So again, that could be also the explanation. He brings here down here that the births here were also connected, also on a spiritual level. Either way, the point is that this was only possible because they were in Goshen, and the fact that only the Jewish people multiplied on that level, and the Egyptians, even though they were close by, they had normal birth rates. That indicates that they were under different jurisdictions. That the Jews were under the jurisdiction of the Kedusha, which because it was Sarah's province. But the Mitzrayim, Ba'atam, Ikarosh, Asam Mitzrayim, they weren't able to channel that type of multiplicity growth in their world. Al-Ken, now we understand how last week's parasha is a introduction and an explanation to Vayechi Yaakov. Yaakov had a good life. 17 years, the last 17 years of his life were years of life. Chayim v'tova. V'lo od, not only were they good on their own, they actually reframed his entire life. Gam kol hashanim harishonot that was suffered, there was the me'megurim v'tzar, now he can be renamed Shnot Chayim Yikaru. Now they're called good years. Ve'en ze ki'im l'ma shekol zaro hayu nechazim b'kedusha. The only way this was possible, the only way Yaakov was able to have good years while he was in Egypt, was because we look back in last week's parasha, introducing the good years of Yaakov. How were Yaakov's years in Egypt good years? Because they lived in Goshen. V'alken satama parasha ki alv shevayach zuba. Because they lived in Goshen and they were able to hold on to their spiritual root in heaven. Alken vayechi Yaakov shnot chayim. This is the way. This is the only way it was possible for Yaakov to have years of good life in Mitzrayim. Yeah, so here in the bottom here he brings the entire Zohar that we mentioned before, that this is really the Zohar also describes this entire process that Rabbi Shimon says. Why is there no space between the two parashot? So says Rabbi Shimon, because you can't separate between the two. So the Zohar says his whole life was a life of suffering. When he came to Egypt and he saw his son, and he realized that they lived in Egypt but they were still holy, he became happy and he had good years. Again, the Zohar goes into different details, different explanations, but that's the same similar explanation that the Alshech is giving us. So now Alshech finishes off. So this is a very interesting thing. We just mentioned that if Yaakov's family would have been in Mitzrayim, that would have cut them off from the spiritual connection. They wouldn't have been able to continue being connected to the Kedusha. But that says Rav Moshe is only true regarding Yaakov's children. But Yaakov himself, he was unshakable. Yaakov himself, no matter where you exist geographically, he would remain holy. He would always remain alive. Ki kadosh hu le'elahav. Yaakov is so holy and so alive that doesn't make a difference to him. V'techi rucho gam sham b'Mitzrayim. Even if he would just be talking about himself, it would be fine. But it was for his family. That's where he needed the Goshen, and that's why in this week's parasha, this is another question we had before. Last week it says they were in Goshen. Here, when we're talking about Yaakov, it doesn't say Goshen, it just says Mitzrayim, to point out that Yaakov himself didn't need to be in Goshen, because he himself was on this level of holiness and completion. The land, the impurity of the lands wasn't able to affect him. Others who weren't on the level of wholesomeness that he was, Be'eretz Goshen, he had to be in Goshen for his children. So this is an interesting message that Rav Moshe is telling us, that we see in the parasha here, that sometimes parents on their own have already figured it out, they're stable enough in their holiness to be able to live in a certain place or do certain things or be exposed to certain energies. But for the children, because the children aren't complete yet and they haven't yet worked out their lives through, sometimes for the children we have to make sure to be in a more secure zone, not exposed to the tumor of Mitzrayim or other tumors, for the sake of the children, even though Yaakov himself didn't. And if the children would have been affected, that would have affected Yaakov as well, obviously, because all he cared about was having a holy family. So B'ezrat Hashem, we should be zocher to have a holy family and holy selves. And thank you, Hashem. So we'll continue next time, B'ezrat Hashem. Okay, so we're continuing the holy parashat of Parashat Vayechi with the Alshech HaKadosh in the Alshech Academy in Tzfat Israel. So we're up to the second pasuk of the parasha, which describes Yaakov's request of his son Yosef to be buried in Eretz Israel in Marat HaMachpelah. He does not want to be buried in Egypt, and we'll see all about that and exactly what was the details of this discussion right now. So the pasuk says, "Vayikrevu yemei Yisrael amut." The days of Israel, of Yisrael, were coming closer to his death. Vayikra levno Yosef. He called his son Yosef. He called his son to Yosef. Vayomer lo imna. He said to him as follows: Imna matzat zichem beinecha. If I now, or I please find favor in your eyes, simna yadcha tachat yarechi. Place your hand under my leg. Vasita imadi chesed ve'emet. Do for me kindness and truth. Al na tigbareni Mitzrayim. Do not bury me in Egypt. So again, Rav Moshe, in his beautiful fashion, is going to take issue with the details in order to reveal the secret messages that are hidden between the lines. So number one we need to now understand is as follows. Ma inyan shanato et ta'amo. The first pasuk this week's parasha starts off Vayechi Yaakov. Yaakov lived. Now this pasuk, referring to his death, moves over to his other name, Yisrael. What's going on? Why Yaakov here and Yisrael here? Number 2, Nashit Lev al Amrova Yikra Liv No Yosef. Lama Lo Tzivat Kulam. Why didn't he request this request from all of his sons? Why just Yosef? Number 3, Lamed Shel Le Yosef Meyuteret. Now we mentioned it before. It says that he called his son his Yosef, like Liv No Le Yosef. You should just say Vayikra Liv No Yosef. Gam Liv No Meyuteret. You could just say Vayikra Le Yosef. Why does it have to say his son? Number 4, so even if he's requesting it of Yosef, why does Yosef himself have to do the carrying? Yosef can remain doing his important public service in Egypt, and he can send his brothers, they'll go do the burial. Number 5, so says Moshe, we weren't sure when we say Al Na.
Go get the keys.
Al Natik Bereni. So the question, what does Na mean? Na can either mean please or it can mean now. So it says Ramosha, in this case, in this context, it can't mean please, because then he would have to say Na al Tik Bereni Mitzrayim. Please don't. Not don't please. So when it says Al Na, it seems then it has to mean now. But what does it mean don't bury me now? When then? Like what is now? Now as opposed to what? V'gam omro v'asita imadi ki hayal lomar la'asot imadi ki omro v'asita. So it says don't bury me in Egypt, and you should do. It doesn't say don't bury me in Egypt and that will be for me a kind act. It says don't bury me in Egypt and additionally do for me a kind act. What is this extra additional act of kindness and truth that he's doing for him? Number 6, Amro v'shachavti im avotai. What does it mean? I'm going to lie with my fathers. Why is he describing his death in this strange manner of lying with his fathers? Lama karata mita shchiva im avot. Number 7, Lama lo tziva et banav yalu et atzmotav imahem kasher asa Yosef. Why does he I was just wondering because it seems to be the same question he asked before. So why doesn't he not say? Oh, that's what he's asking. Why does Yaakov tell them to do it straight away? Why doesn't he tell them to take his bones with them when they go out of Mitzrayim, when they have the Exodus, just like Yosef did? Yosef also didn't want to be buried in Mitzrayim. And all of the Shvatim as well says they would take it out. So why does Yaakov need to be buried instantly in Eretz Israel? Why can't he temporarily be housed in Egypt? Number 8, Ki halo bichlal omro anochi e'aseh kidvarecha, uhu sheyasim yado tachat yerecho v'yishavalo. So if we look in the pasuk, it says that Yaakov requested of Yosef to do what he asked. He's asking him to bury him in Eretz Israel. And part of the request Yaakov said is, swear to me that you will do that. And then he says, Vayomar, Yosef replies, Anochi eseh kidvarecha, I'll do as you asked. Vayomer, and Yaakov asked, Hishavali. Why is Yaakov asking him to swear again? He agreed to swear, so he's going to do it. Why is there to be another request of having to make an oath? Vayishaval, he made an oath. Why is that an extra request besides the original request? And another question Moshe says, Gam milat li or milat lo shtei miyutarot. Why does it not say Vayomer Hishava? Even if he is asking for him to make an oath, and he made an oath. Why make an oath to me and he made an oath to him? Gam ma inyan shtachvayato Rosh Habitah Chashvot Yosef. The pasuk finishes off, and Yaakov bowed, prostrated himself towards Yosef, to Yosef in the direction of the head of the bed. I mean, it's not clear if it was to Yosef. Rashi says it was to Yosef, but in the direction of the Shechina. Others say it was only to the Shechina. But either way, what is this Hishtachavaya, this bowing. What is that talking about? Okay, so this is the end of the questions, and from these questions we'll come to get a more of an understanding of what was Yaakov's request and what he needed specifically done, and why so badly he didn't want to be buried in Egypt. So now, this is actually a very, very powerful piece of Gemara, which there's many commentaries trying to understand this Gemara, but this is going to serve an introduction to what the whole story with Yaakov here is, regarding his burial and regarding everything else. So what does the Gemara say in Ta'anit, Masechet Ta'anit 5b? It says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan says, Yaakov Avinu lo met. Yaakov, our forefather, didn't die. So what does the Gemara say? What do you mean he didn't die? The pasuk describes that he was mummified, he was eulogized, and it says that he was buried. I believe that's the three questions. So the question is, says that's the Gemara. So that's the question the Gemara asks. What does the Rabbi Yochanan reply? He says, I can't help you. I have a pasuk that I'm being deirish. I'm expounding a pasuk that says as follows: V'ata al tari avdi Yaakov, don't fear my servant Jacob, etc. Ve'et zarecha mi'eretz shivyam. The pasuk refers, the prophecy to Yaakov refers to Yaakov and his offspring. So he says, I'm going to now compare him to his offspring. Makish hula zaro, ma zaro b'chayim afu b'chayim. If we know that Yaakov's offspring are alive, because obviously one of the offspring of Yaakov are always alive at every given moment, so too he's always still alive. So that's the Gemara. Very strange Gemara, not really understandable. And Ramosh is obviously, in his great style, going to go through a few questions specifically. What is hard to understand with this Gemara? First of all, Ma me'shivla al kushiyato b'omro mikra ani doresh. So yeah, he said Rabbi Yochanan is saying an extremely strange statement. Yaakov didn't die. And they asked him very obvious questions. How can you say he didn't die? He obviously did die. And what does he answer? Oh, I found a pasuk that mentions Yaakov in the same verse as his offspring. Oh, and my drasha that I'm going to now make is to say that he's still alive. But if the reality of the situation is that he's not alive, from the fact that we know that he was mummified and eulogized and everything, then seemingly you're not expounding that pasuk in the right way, because that pasuk doesn't clearly say that he's still alive. It just mentions him and his children in one verse. So your drasha that you're making by comparing him and his children is obviously off. So you've got to drop that drasha. V'adarabba titbatila drasha, he just drop the drasha and go with the fact. Right? This question is so obvious, and he's going this Gemara needs a lot of explanation. We'll see how Ramosha approaches it. Number 2, v'od ra'ui la'ir lama lo hikshalam ha'pasuk she'omer v'yom Yisrael Yosef hinei anochi met. This parasha, we have this parasha clearly in the words of Yaakov. He says, I'm going to die. Hinei anochi met. So obviously Yaakov himself knew he was going to die. When we pasuk v'yikrvu yemei Yisrael amud, the pasuk we just saw, the days of Israel's death came closer. So the pasuk clearly says that he was dying. And the pasuk also says vayigva vayasef alamav, that he departed and he was gathered into his nation. Number 3, va'od shelo haya Alshech Shul b'kdichantu. So now Rav Moshe is going to take issue with the choice of question that they choose in the Gemara to challenge this statement. What do they ask? They say, if he was still alive, what was the purpose of mummifying him? Why would they do that for no reason? So obviously he must have been dead. That's the question the Gemara says. Says Rav Moshe, ki im v'chi haya chai v'hemitu. The Rav Moshe says, I've got a more compelling way to ask this question. Well, it's a different question really, but the question should have been as follows. Let's say he didn't die, but that was only until he was mummified, because how does mummifying work? what's the first step we do? We remove the intestines, because that's going to cause decomposition. So obviously when his intestines were removed, that's when he would have died. So even if you're saying he lived, that he must have died at that stage. So it's not just asking why did they do it. The question should be, we know they did it because the pasuk says they did it, and Yosef got his doctors in Egypt to do it. So then how did he survive that process? וגם היה לו להקשות, אפשר חנתו אותו בדדי הוצאות מאב ונשאר חי. So he's saying he obviously wouldn't have survived this whole thing. Right? So the question is, how were they able to mummify him without doing the removal of the intestines? Sounds like they're saying, okay, I agree that he's still alive. The question is just, if he's still alive, then you wouldn't need to preserve his flesh. אלא שאומר כי לא היה פחד שיסביך כי חיו בחינם חנתו וגם בחינם הסבידו וקברו לבלתי צורך. והלא טוב היה להכחיש לו הנחה להכחיש בדרך שחשבנו. So Ramosh is saying, from the questioning, it seems that the questioner isn't really challenging the premise of him being alive. It's just saying, why would they then mummify, eulogize, and bury him? It seems strange, but really the question is way stronger. The question is, once they mummified him, he wouldn't be alive anymore. So what's going on? How can you say he's still alive? Says Rav Moshe, let's try and get into this. Let's try and get into this by looking at the wording of the Pesukim. Kol makom. Rav Moshe says, I've done the research, and the following is true. Every time it mentions Yaakov death, Yaakov dying, it doesn't use the word Yaakov, it says Yisrael. B'shem Yisrael yechaneu. Makom asher yazkir gvi'a va'asifa, when it uses terms of departing and gathering into the world of the living in the different realm, it doesn't say death. It says vayigva vayasef, which means that he contracted and he gathered in. So it doesn't use the word death explicitly when the name Yaakov is mentioned. It says Yisrael said, I'm going to die. That was last week when he met Yosef. And also Yisrael Yosef he met. And also we saw now Yisrael amut. So when it says the word mavet mita, it only uses the word name Yisrael. When Yaakov is used, it doesn't say death. It says vayigva v'yasef alav. So because of this question, Ra'iti gever chacham ba'oz v'tatzumot mit'ametz la'amid. So Ramosh is quoting a commentary that wants to say that because of this truth, that we see that Yisrael died and the name Yaakov didn't die, he wants to say that the name Yaakov is of a higher level than the name Yisrael, and therefore, even though Yisrael can die, Yaakov can't die. But that's very strange. Because we know that Yaakov is lower than Yisrael, even though it's the same level. Yaakov is lower, and then Yisrael, because Yisrael comes later. As we know, this is a well-known thing that's mentioned in Chazal and in Zohar and different commentaries. So we can't. This can't be the conclusion that we come to based on this information that we have, that death is only mentioned by Yisrael, not by Yaakov. But says Rav Moshe, I'm going to use this concept and understand it differently. Ki na'afochu. Ki kasher nikra shemo Yisrael. When Yaakov was given the name Yisrael, what does that mean? That means that Yaakov was given a whole new level of life. Yaakov was his name he was born with, but he achieved so much in his life that he basically assumed a whole new version of life, a whole new deeper dimension of his purpose in this world, with a whole new name representing that new level of soul and paradigm of existence that he achieved. And he got, and this name came along with Rucho v'nishmato Yitron Or Yakar, a very deep, holy rare light, ram v'nisabim ma'od ma'od, way more elevated and lofty than what he had until then. V'nei yadua ki geler mita, hu siluk hanefesh me'aguf. So how does death work, says Rav Moshe? Death works, very simply, what makes a body be alive is if the soul is enlivening the body. The body is a piece of matter that has the laws of entropy applied to it and the laws of decomposition of organic matter. It's only if the soul animates the body is the body alive. So death means the soul departing the body. But usually, what parts of the soul leave the body? Only the neshama and the ruach. We know we have nefesh, ruach, neshama, which is the nefesh is the physical aspect of the body, because we know that, for example, animals also have a nefesh. So nefesh, even though human nefesh isn't necessarily the same nefesh as an animal, but it's the level of life force that a nefesh gives is connected to the physical body. It's housed, spiritually housed in the liver. The liver is the center of sorted nutrients of the food we eat and sort of cleansing the blood, and that's basically the blood is the physical life force of the person. The ruach and the neshama are the more spiritual and higher parts of a person. And so when a person dies, essentially the ruach and the neshama go up to heaven, whereas the nefesh kind of remains with the kever. I say kind of in dead body. It's not really the nefesh. The Arizal calls it the nefesh of the nefesh. Basically, the lowest part of a person remains with the body, and that's why we call it kever in the language of the Mishnah. It isn't called a kever; it's called a nefesh, because it's where the nefesh is housed, and so that's the right. We go to a kever of a tzaddik, because his nefesh is still there, and that's his connection to the body, so that when the revival of the dead happens, they should still be a life force connected to this specific body that exists in the kever. So with that being said, Yaakov Avinu, because he was very unique, and he received a whole new set of neshama with his new name of Yisrael. So now, Yaakov and Israel are similar to the nefesh and the ruach neshama. So even though Yaakov consists of an entire trio of nefesh, ruach, neshama, being the whole existence, the full existence. But now that he has the level of Yisrael, then Yaakov is equivalent to that lower part that stays with the body. So now, says Ramosha, very, very, very deep, Rabbi Say, Yaakov Avinu lo met. Yaakov didn't die because Yaakov level stayed with the body. Yisrael, the higher level of his consciousness, that went up to Shamayim. Just like the Neshama and Ruach. But the Yaakov Avinu lo met. Yisrael Avinu did die. So let's see inside Ramosh is going to help us understand this. כי הנה הגדר הגדול שנתוסף על נפשו רוחו נשמתו כשהייתה ישראל, הוא אשר נסתלק ממנו בעצם. What departed him when he died? The additional part that was given to him at a later stage, the Yisrael's part. על כן יצדק בו לשון מיתה, כי הבחינה היא מתה ונסתלק מיעקב לגמרי. So when we say that Yisrael died, it doesn't mean that Yisrael is lower, so it has death affect it. It means that it's higher, and the process of death, which means that the soul goes back to where it came from, whereas the body goes back to where it came from, dust of the earth. So which part of Yaakov's soul went back to where it came from? The higher part of his soul, which was the Yisrael part. So now we have Yisrael departing Yaakov. So usually it's the soul departing the body. Here we have the deeper level of soul departing the lower level of soul. But that lower level of soul remained with his body Al ken kol makom asher yazkir mita b'shem Yisrael yichane. Every time death is mentioned regarding Yaakov, it says the word Israel, because that's only the part of it that departed. Ach b'chinat Yaakov hu hageder shayav mitchila. The level of consciousness that he was born with, his lower level, Yaakov, that didn't die. What happened to it? Rak gava k'mishnit alef. It only contracted and kind of became dormant, as if he's in a state of nit aleph. What's nit aleph? It means when someone like faints, like in a state of coma kind of thing. Shadaim kol kochot nafsho rucho v'nishmato dvekim bo be'etzem. The nefesh, ruach, and neshama of Yaakov remained connected to his body. Al ken b'Yaakov lo ne'emar rak vayigva v'yasef. He contracted and he went into a state of dormancy, but he didn't die. It doesn't say vayamot. Like when it says vayitzchak, it says vayigva yitzchak vayamot vayasef. That word is omitted on purpose. V'al ken asher itiva asher dibru Yaakov avinu lo met. What does Yaakov avinu mean? Shehu b'chinat Yaakov be'et shaya avinu. When Yaakov was still our father, meaning when he fathered us. When did Yaakov father his children? When he was still called Yaakov. It was only on the way into Israel that he received the name Yisrael, and when all of his children were born already. Terem shenikro Shmo Yisrael. The entire Yaakov soul paradigm was left its entirety in the body. So now Ramosh is going to say, the truth is that lots of tzaddikim aren't considered dead fully. They're considered the sleepers of the earth. Their body doesn't actually decompose. Why? Because there's a life force inside of their body that prevents it from decomposing, as if they would be alive. What would be proof to this? There's a few proofs. Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Shayam Mekadesh Beveto B'Kol Shabbat. Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, would come every Friday night to his home to do Kiddush. Even though it doesn't say he basically had the ability to come back to this world, even though he wasn't actually alive. ורבי אלעזר בן רבי שמעון שהיה שופט את ישראל 22 שנים בתוך חדרו החסידות. The Gemara brings regarding the son of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai that he remained in his cellar, in his house, in his loft, in the attic for 22 years, and he would judge the people. They would ask him questions. Rabbi Chia bar Yoshia, you see different stories in the Gemara that the rabbis remained alive after they were dead. What remained in their spirit wasn't their full consciousness. It was just a part of the nefesh. As we mentioned before, the Arizal says it's called the nefesh, havla, the garmi. It's like the lowest level of life force that is connected to the body. And again, these tzaddikim are so holy that even this level of life force is enough to keep their bodies alive, or their bodies intact. And again, all these stories doesn't necessarily mean Rebbe, when he came to the family for a night, it didn't mean that he came with his physical body. He came with a spiritual body. But it means that he was still connected to this world, and his nefesh didn't completely depart. So he's saying that even though this concept exists with other tzaddikim, but with Yaakov it was on a whole different level. That with him, he had his nefesh, ruach, and neshama of Yaakov level. Al ken bisroi yitbarach tehaleh shchina gam et gufo gam hu. So he said, when Yaakov went down to Egypt, he was afraid to go down. What did Hashem tell him in a vision that Hashem came to him? Hashem said, don't fear going down to Egypt, because I will go down with you. And I will also take you out. Hashem said, I'll take you out. Did Hashem take him out? He didn't. He died in Egypt. But no, Hashem took him out with his body and his soul. because his entire level of soul of Yaakov was still alive in his body. All of his energy of his soul remained. This is a very deep thing that Rashi brings, that when the brothers took Yaakov out in his coffin, they took him in the order of the encampments of the flags in the desert. And we know the desert, when the Jews were in the desert, they surrounded the Mishkan in a specific manner, like the Malachim of the Merkavah, the holy chariot, the divine chariot. And Yaakov Avinu, who was had the Shechina rest on him, his divine soul, the soul of Yaakov Avinu and the body of Yaakov Avinu, because the Shechina was still resting on it, because he was still alive, his soul was still there. Therefore, they carried it in the state of the way that the Merkavah of the Shechina, which includes 12 different faces, 3 on each side, 4 sides, and the 12 tribes carried them in that way of the Merkavah of the Shechina. Why? Because his soul, which is the soul of Yaakov Avinu, was still alive in it. Interestingly enough, the Ramak, on a side note, says, why did Yaakov Avinu, the Avot in general, he says this about actually, why didn't they become angels like Eliyahu Navi and Chanoch? So he says a very interesting thing, a very deep thing, that when a person becomes an angel, it's not as high as the Avot. The Avot were actually Merkava to the Sefirot of Atzilut, which is even higher than angels. So therefore, Eliyahu and Chanoch is a lower level than that. But then he asks, well, what about after they die? Once they're dead, their souls are holy, but their bodies now are dead, decomposing or being buried and dead in the ground. So at least what they could have done is they could have had this metamorphosis of their bodies becoming redefined and purified to receive the state of an angel's body. So why did that not happen to them? So the Ramak says that the bodies of the forefathers in Hebron are actually still alive with the spirit of their bodies as they were when they were alive. So therefore, they would still be losing out if their bodies were transformed into bodies of an angel, even though the body of an angel is very, very spiritual, and obviously is not at all like a body of a human being. But the Avot were a whole different story. Their body actually was purified in the sense that it was actually a chariot for the Shechina. So now we're going to explain, says Rav Moshe, Al ken lohi kshula. So now Rabbi Yochanan says an outrageous statement about the fact that Yaakov Avinu didn't die. They didn't ask him a question of where it says Vayechi met that Israel said he's going to die, because as we just explained, that Yaakov Avinu didn't die, but Israel died, and it all fits. And the fact that what about the fact that they had to open his stomach and take out his intestines? In his case, they mummified him with his intestines inside, says Rav Moshe. Later on, in Perek Nun, Pasuk Bet, says Rav Moshe, I'm going to prove to you that the mummification of Yosef was done differently to the usual manner, and his intestines were left inside. That's why he says as follows. It says, the pasuk says, "Vayitzav Yosef et avadav." Yosef commanded his servants, et harofim, the doctors, lachnot et aviv, to mummify Yaakov. And then it says, "Vayachantu harofim et Israel," and the doctors did the mummification. So he says a very interesting thing. He says, why did Yosef originally Yosef thought Yaakov was dead because he seemed dead. But then he noticed that he's not actually dead. He noticed there's still aliveness in his body. So that's why originally he said he commanded his servants to do the pre-mummification process, which is the removal of the intestines, because that's not a professional job. That's something any cowboy can cut open the intestines and take it out. But the doctors usually take over the second stage, where they do the mummification once the intestines have been removed. But once Yosef realized that Yaakov was actually still alive on some level, he then cancelled the job of the servants, and he told the doctors to mummify him with the intestines inside. Very interesting. He brings here the Zohar says also that in this case they didn't take out his stomach, and instead they injected persimmon oil through his navel into his stomach. That's what the Zohar says. So there seems to be a discussion about this procedure of the mummification. But at least what Rav Moshe is telling us here is that he didn't think that he would have died because they didn't actually open his stomach. So what was the question? How is the Gemara challenging Rabbi Yochanan by asking, why did they do this for no reason? Why did they mummify him? So if you know that he didn't die, that his entire spectrum of soul, nefesh, ruach, and neshama, did not leave him, then obviously he wouldn't decompose. He's not like other people that the reason their body decomposes is because of the life force has left them, or at least like the vast majority of it besides the last part of the nefesh. So the question is only, what's the purpose of this mummification? He would have obviously remained in state of his body would have remained whole without it. So he says as follows: if you would have found me a pasuk that says clearly that he's stayed alive, I would have backtracked. But it's the other way around. I found a pasuk. I found a drasha, even though it's not a clear pasuk, it's a drasha. That he's still alive. So you're asking me what was the purpose? I'll tell you what the purpose. I don't need to explain to you really, because I'm using a drasha of a pasuk. But why did he do it? Says the Alshech B'nei mat shetarchu levli tzorech ma gam ki yada ken Yosef astir hadavar. So why did Yosef do it? Because Yosef didn't want it to become public news that Yaakov remained alive. Why? Because it wasn't necessary for people to know this. V'adarabah, not only was it not necessary, there was actually it would be a problem if people knew. Pen yasu Eloha, they might make him into an idol, and because they would see, whoa, this guy's dead, and he's still his body isn't decomposing. Al ken tzivalach not daviv. Therefore, he told them he wanted to hide his aliveness with the fact that he was mummified. So really, what Moshe is saying is that obviously he didn't seem alive to the untrained eye, which was why Yosef actually originally thought he actually passed away. But he was in a very, very deep state of coma. Again, it seems to be not such a physical, scientific life, because ultimately, he was buried and there's no oxygen there or whatever. But the point is that when we refer to death and life spiritually, we're talking about the departure of the soul from the body. And Ramosh is telling us that because Yaakov had a double-layered soul in his body, he had the Yaakov soul and the Yisrael soul. The Yaakov soul in its entirety remained in his body, so therefore we can't consider that death, because the entire spectrum of soul exists in his body. So even though his heart stopped beating, but there was no departure of soul from body, and that actually would have prevented decomposition. Just like Ramosh says, sometimes tzaddikim that only have a small part of the nefesh left in the body prevents decomposition. But we didn't want to reveal that, so that's why he still mummified it. So now, what was his pasuk? He brought a pasuk that mentions that Yaakov is, don't fear my servant Jacob, because your children are going to be brought back from the land of captivity. So he says, "V'yakish hu v'zarosh Yoshem," I'm going to help you and your children come back from the enemy's land. So you can't say that means after Yaakov comes back to life, after the revival of the dead. Ki im sheyu v'mitziat achad mazaro b'chayim. Lo amar mazaro chai afu chai. It doesn't say that he's alive. It says that he's in life. So it seems to be that when Yaakov, in his state of coma, in his state of very deep sleep, that we're referring to this type of life to, that just like the life of the Jewish of all the Jewish people as that are the offspring of Yaakov, or bachayim. What does bachayim mean? That they have their entire soul layer of nefesh, ruach, and shama inside of their body. So too, he also had the soul, nefesh, ruach, and shama inside his body, even though he wasn't actually alive. He wasn't animatedly alive. That would mean chai. So Ramesh is making a distinction between chai and bachayim. Chai means that he's alive and kicking, and bachayim means he's in the category of being alive in the terms of the soul remaining in his body. So this is interesting. There's actually a Rav Hutnas has a different explanation, a bit different to what we said. I should mention it as a side note real quick. He says that the revival of the dead that is going to happen to the Jewish people at the end of days is really the ultimate purpose of creation itself. The purpose of creation is that the physical should become so infused with godliness that it doesn't have to be dependent on the laws of nature that therefore stipulate that it has to die and decompose at some point. It should have the eternity of a soul, right? Which means that the physical has been penetrated by the spiritual, and is now achieves levels of eternity that the spiritual has. So Yaakov started this process, but he wasn't able, and in his time, to bring it down all the way to the level of reality that we exist in. So he says a very interesting thing. He says, we know there's pardes, pshat, remez, drash, and sod. So on the level of sod, everything's spirituality, everything's holiness. But the level of pshat, things are simple. The pshat is the revealed version of reality. But all these levels exist simultaneously inside of each other, whereas pshat being the outermost layer of reality that kind of hides the truth that exists further in. So when he said Yaakov is still alive, and they said, but I saw, or the pasuk says, we describing him as being mummified, eulogized, and buried, he says, you're right. On the pshat level, he died. That's why the pasuk is describing him. On the outside, we saw a normal death. But mikra ani doresh, I'm talking to you on the drash level, which is a deeper level dimension of reality in the pardes. So even on the drash level, Yaakov brought down the concept that the Jewish people, the Yisrael, the Bnei Yisrael, don't die. We've brought it down from sod to drash. Eventually, the job is to bring that down all the way to pshat. And Eliyahu Navi, he was actually Eliyahu and Yaakov are connected. As we know, they have the vav of Eliyahu being taken by Yaakov, and they have like this whole thing of Eliyahu is forcing Yaakov is forcing Eliyahu to come and fulfill the promise of the end of days, because Yaakov and Eliyahu are both on this mission of revealing this inherent truth that the Jewish people's physical body is actually a spiritual thing. And Yaakov started it, and Eliyahu showed that it's possible for a Jew to elevate their body so high to remain alive forever. And eventually Eliyahu will come back to prove that that is true with all Jews. And to bring that down all the way to the physical realm of Pshat. So that's an interesting thing from Rav Hutner. But, so we'll finish with this for now, and we'll continue next time. Bezrat Hashem. Here comes next time.
Okay.
No, I'm actually. Yeah, is there any water in the fridge there? Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, everyone. We're back again with the Alshech Academy. We're learning parashat Vayechi, and we're going to be learning all about Yaakov Avinu's life and his life after life, and we're going to see why Yaakov Avinu didn't want to be buried in Egypt. Okay, so he says as follows: "V'inyan hakatuv masha amru ki Yaakov atzmo haya b'Mitzrayim b'tzed zaro misham." So it says, actually, the Midrash says, he brings it as follows: the Midrash says that Yaakov Avinu was at Yetziat Mitzrayim with the Jewish people. What does it say? It says, B'tzet Yisrael Mitzrayim. The Midrash says, B'tzet Yisrael Mitzrayim. Who are we talking about when we say that Yisrael left Mitzrayim? Yisrael means Yisrael, Yaakov Avinu. Yisrael Saba, our forefather Yisrael. So what's going on here? And not only that, it actually mentions it also regarding the ultimate final redemption in the end of days. Gam la'atid ne'emar, b'tzet zaro eretz shivya. As we mentioned before, that Yaakov is going to come back with we're connecting. We mentioned last time that we're connecting Yaakov to his children, that just like they're going to come back alive from the exile, he's also going to come back. It says, Ki meit seitcha me'eretz Mitzrayim. Just like in the days of the Exodus of Egypt, Arenu niflaot, I will show them wonders. Who am I going to show wonders? Says the Midrash. Yaakov. I'm going to show him. He's going to be there to witness the wonders of the final redemption. As the Midrash says in Shmot. Arenu, I'm going to show him. It doesn't say Arecha. I'm going to show you. Because it says that when you leave Egypt, I'll show him. Why does it say I'll show you? So we're referring to somebody else that isn't there, but he's there to notice, to be present at the time. He also brings in the bottom of Zohar that talks about this idea of Yaakov being alive and present at the times of all the exoduses. As we mentioned last time, that the Yaakov, he achieved a whole new level of existence. That he started off as Yaakov, and then he was given a new level of existence called Yisrael. And when he died, what does death mean? Death means the departure of soul from body. Which part of his soul, which soul left him? The soul of Yisrael left. But the soul of Yaakov remained. And his entire existence that he was born with, the level of Yaakov, that remained with him forever. Still with him. Just like Moshe mentioned last time, other tzaddikim also have a level of nefesh that remains in their body that is unnoticeable. Even though it seems they're dead, the nefesh, some level of nefesh remains. Just the life force that he had before he received the Yisrael additional upgrade remained with him. He's like a live person who's asleep. That has his entire paradigm of soul. As we said, it doesn't say the word Vayamat with Yaakov, it just says Vayigva Vayasef, leaving out the word of Mita. The part of Yaakov contracted and went into a coma. So here's explaining Vayigva Vayasef. Vayigva means his body contracted and remained still, but didn't say it dies. And Vayasef means he was gathered up to his fathers up in heaven. That is regarding his soul called Yisrael that departed and went up to heaven. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher hakol nהיה b'dvaro. Od hakdama acheret. So Moshe tells another introduction to get into this whole concept of Yaakov Avinu's life after life and his burial after he's seemingly half dead, fully alive situation. So we know that it says in lots of places that tzaddikim, before they die, they know that they're going to die. How do they know they're going to die? That it says as follows: Ki shloshem yom kodem hasiluk, 30 days before a soul departs, haneshama ola b'chol laila upokedet mekoma. The soul every night goes and gets to do a pilot trip 30 times to get to know its place in heaven. It goes to visit its heavenly spot. That's why the tzaddik knows in advance. And Rav Moshe brings a story in the Zohar. Rav Yitzchak in the Zohar, he felt that he's going to die, as the story is mentioned at length in the Zohar. So that's one concept of the tzaddik's soul going up to Gan Eden 30 days before. Another introduction, says Rav Moshe, V'hu ki hinei yadua ki nishmot Yisrael olot hashamayma al eretz ha'elyona shel umat eretz Yisrael. So what's Rav Moshe saying? When the soul goes up to heaven, it goes up to heaven, it goes up to the spiritual land, the land of the living. The land of the living is the spiritual version of Eretz Israel, meaning in the spiritual realm, there's also a concept called the land, the place where the souls exist. This is the land of souls. The land of souls is the spiritual version of Eretz Israel. There is no spiritual land of the rest of the world, because only Eretz Israel is the Holy Land, and therefore it has a source of the land of the living in heaven. And therefore, only if a soul dies in Eretz Israel does it go directly up to the land of the living. Ki aleh terachef. Why is Eretz Israel holy? Because it lies beneath and is a direct manifestation of the land of the living, which is the spiritual version called Eretz HaChaim, Eretz Elyona, the upper world, the upper land. Ach Eretz Ha'amim Lokin, the land of the nations, the other parts of the world, don't have that holiness. Ki alei yarachfu sarim chitzonim. The 70 nations of the world have 70 ministers in heaven, as we mentioned last time, and they are the ones that channel holiness, or not holiness, or spiritual energy to them. But it's not holy. It's contaminated by the 70 nations of the world. Al Ken, says Rav Moshe, Tov la'isha Yisraeli. It's good for a Jewish person, for Isha Yisraeli, ladur v'lamut be'Eretz Yisrael, to live and die in Eretz Yisrael. Not just die, but to live and die in Eretz Yisrael. Ki b'chayav gadel b'toch ha'kedusha. When he's alive and he lives in Israel, he's living in holiness. U'b'tzet nafsho. When he dies, derech yeshara b'toch ha'kedusha. His soul finds a direct path, constantly remaining in the realm of holiness. Taleh ad shoshai Elokim asher natanah, and go straight up to the Lord who created it. It doesn't have to go through any hostile territory, so to speak, because v'nefach, this would be not the case with one who lives in Chutz La'aretz. Ki yichyeh toch tumah. His entire life, he is in the realm of the tumah. Ubemoto, when he dies, taleh nafsho bekerev tumot chitzoniyot haaretz ha'ich lo b'tova. His soul has to go through hostile airspace until he's able to get out, and then only once it makes it out of the realm of the nations, as to go, then it can start heading towards to its place, to God. It's impossible not to get through different scary situations. It's basically, if you're going flying through enemy territory, there's going to be scares and there's going to be problems. And obviously, specifically, if a soul isn't fully worthy, there's going to be a chance for it to be attacked. It doesn't have protection. So basically, it's not. Nobody wants to be a soul straight away when you die. The first thing you're faced is having to deal with spiritual negative enemies of whatever land we are dying in and we're living in. So that's why it's good to live in Eretz Israel and to die in Eretz Israel. So Moshe says this is only average Jews, or not great tzaddikim, but people that are complete, gdolei hashlemut, those who have completed themselves in their lives, won't have this issue. Even though they exist in Chutz La'aretz, as we said last time, Yaakov Avinu, he himself, he wouldn't be affected by the tumah of Mitzrayim, because he remains with the Shechina. As when Yaakov left from Eretz Yisrael to Mitzrayim, Hashem said, "V'hinei Anochi imach." You're going to remain in the bubble of holiness, even though you're in Mitzrayim. V'gam b'tzet nafsho lo ta'aleh b'kerev ha'chitzonim. Because he's with the Shechina, when his soul departs, he will be able to be given a protective bubble of Kedusha, allowing his soul complete immunity through the negative airspace straight up to heaven. As Hashem is with the soul, so even though Yaakov died in Chutz La'aretz, he didn't have the issue. And this is also something that happened to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Alshech is going to mention that Moshe Rabbeinu, he also died in Chutz La'aretz. He wasn't zocher to go into Eretz Israel. And the Midrash brings, Moshe had a conversation with his soul, and he said as follows, Heichan at atidal elech. Where are you heading? Interesting expression. Where are you heading? Amralo et halech lefnei Hashem ba'artzot hachayim. I'm going to go straight to heaven, straight to Hashem in the land of the living. Shehu ki haya yareh penyo lichua bekerem chitzoniut midbar shel bet shamad lamala. Moshe was afraid because he's dying in Chutz La'aretz in the midbar. He's going to have to travel through negative enemy airspace. So he made sure that his soul promises him that he's gonna his soul promises he's gonna go straight to heaven. So she said, don't worry, I'm not going to go through a negative airspace. You're protected because you have the Shechina, you have Hashem with you. What Hashem says, I'm going to go down with you into Egypt. Why? So you shouldn't be affected and contaminated by the impurity, the defiled air of the nations of the world. I'm going to take your soul out of Egypt. So it shouldn't be affected by the negative airspace. So Hashem's saying, I'm going to take your soul up to heaven straight away without being affected by the airspace of the Tumah. And also, gam alcha, gam alo. What's the double thing? The soul's going to get protected, and gam alo. Not only that, your body's also going to have a Shechina presence on it, and it's going to go straight up to Eretz Israel. She'al avano et hashchina, kamo she'amru Chazal, k'sha'al ken lo nagu ba'avono zurat banav, al seder tekalim kanada. Nobody was allowed to touch the coffin of Yaakov Avinu. Why? Because the Shechina would have had to leave. The Midrash says he told them exactly how to stand around his coffin, who should stand where, to be a chariot, to be a merkavah to the Shechina, And he says, make sure that no non-Jew or non-circumcised person touches my bed, touches my coffin. Make sure the Shekhinah doesn't depart my body. And we told them exactly how to carry him, the way the Malachim carry the chariot of the Shekhinah. So this is what we're seeing here, that not only was Yaakov Avinu's soul given a protective bubble of diplomatic immunity going through the enemy airspace, it was also his body that was given this Shekhinah presence after he died. But now we have another thing, that Yosef will remain in Egypt. So this is a very interesting thing, that Yosef, he was required to stay in Egypt after Yaakov left, because as we know, Egypt was a terrible, terrible tummy place. And Yaakov, while he was there, as we just mentioned, the Shekhinah was with him. So when Yaakov came down to Egypt, he said to Yosef, Hashem told him, don't you worry, you go down to Egypt, and Yosef will remain, he'll continue after you die. Yashit yado aleinecha, he'll be there when you die. What does it mean he'll be there when you die? He'll be there to continue being a chariot to the Shekhinah in order to keep the kedusha of the avot in Mitzrayim to be there for the rest of the Yaakov's family. And as we know that as long as Yosef was still alive, Yosef or one of the other tribes, other brothers, the Gala didn't begin. The Jewish people didn't descend into spiritual exile completely until all the brothers died. Right? We know there was 3 levels of descending into Galut. There was the first level when Yaakov died, as we see in the first Rashi in this week's parashat, that when Yaakov died, the hearts and eyes of the Jewish people were blocked, as we mentioned last time. So that was like a slight spiritual, it was really the beginning of the end. But not everybody was even aware of that level of descending into exile, because it was the spiritual blockage of the consciousness of the eyes and the soul and the heart, which anybody that's in touch with their spiritual eyes and heart will feel it. But it wasn't something that was so noticeable to your everyday person. And then when Yosef died, there was even more descending into the thing. And then when Levi died, who was the last of the Shvatim, there was a complete breakdown of spiritual connection. And so we see that the Shvatim and Yaakov were able to channel a certain level of Shekhinah into Mitzrayim, while to make sure that the Jews, while they were there, they shouldn't be completely contaminated and fall into chaos of the tomb of Mitzrayim. So Yaakov, Hashem promised Yaakov 2 things. First of all, I'll be there with you, and then when I die, Yosef will remain there. So now let's go back to the pasuk. Vayikrevu Yemei Yisrael Lamut. Yisrael is the soul level of Yisrael, is about to depart the soul level of Yaakov and go up where? To heaven. And how does he know that? Because it was within 30 days of his death, as we mentioned before, because the soul starts to visit its place in heaven for 30 days. So now Vayikra livno Yosef. He calls his son to Yosef. Why? What's unique here? There's 2 things. He's a son, and he's also Yosef, meaning he's going to replace him in being a chariot for the Shekhinah. Merkava l'Shekhinah b'mkomo. V'zeh amar Yosef. Klomar lo shu melech. Rak l'ma shu Yosef. Mip'at atzmo. Ki alav ne'emar Yosef yashid yado le'necha. It was regarding Yosef that Hashem promised that he's going to take over the spiritual level of Yaakov to remain a chariot for the Shekhinah to rest in Mitzrayim. So now that's the number 1. He's calling Yosef to tell him that you need to know about this, because you're the one that's going to continue the Shekhinah. Vayomer lo im na matzati chen. So now he's saying as follows. Lo mamasha emtzachen hu simna yadcha shetishavale. I want you to make an oath. Why? Because there's two things. Ki me'inyan ha'chesed yadati ki vasita imadi chesed ve'emet. I know that you would do this without making an oath, because you love me and you're a good son, and obviously you would do this for your father. But he was afraid that Paro wouldn't allow it, because Paro, actually we see in the end that Paro only allowed him because he made an oath. Where do we see this? Because at the end of the parasha we see that when Yosef requested a special permission to leave Egypt in order to bury Yaakov, he had to specify that he made an oath. And as we know, that in the Midrash it says that Paro didn't let him go originally. And then when he wanted to, until Yosef threatened him, what did Yosef tell him? This is a Gemara in Sota. Shayamano originally didn't let him. Until Yosef said, if you're going to force my hand to make me break the shavua, the oath that I made to my father, you also made me make an oath, that you don't know Hebrew, Yashon HaKodesh, right? There was a big secret, the Paro had to know all the languages, and there was a certain language that he didn't know, and Yosef was going to reveal that he didn't know this language. So basically Paro got the idea of this threat, and therefore he had to let him do it. So we see that the oath actually was what made him receive the permission. When Yosef tells Paro, he says, my father made me make an oath to say the following. What does he mean? What does he need to say? Because the oath wasn't actually in order to make sure I carry out the request. I would have carried out the request without an oath. But the oath was only there so that I can tell Paro that there was an oath and I have to do it. He knew that I can do it on my own, just out of kindness. So unless you decide to prevent me from doing this, I need to have an oath. So now he's saying, if you want to make an oath, if you won't do it, you won't be able to. So now, what does he want him not to do? Not to bury him in Mitzrayim. So what does this mean? So let's look. The Gemara says, what is the Midrash? The very interesting Midrash. The Midrash says, what was the reason that Yaakov didn't want to be married in Mitzrayim? So the Midrash brings three reasons. First of all, because the earth in Mitzrayim is going to turn into lice, kinim, in the Makkah of Kinim. Second reason the Midrash brings, that they shouldn't turn his body into Avodah Zarah, because Yaakov was a spiritual man of God, and the Egyptians, were happy to make anything into an idol. So Yaakov didn't want that to happen. And another thing is, Shelo Yipaduba Mitzrim, that the Mitzrim shouldn't have to use him as a reason to have a schut, because they housed his body. So Ramosh is saying, what is going on here? Why is the Midrash looking for reasons that Yaakov wanted to be buried in Eretz Israel? What do you mean? You want to be buried in Israel because it's the best thing you can do? Or why would anyone want to be buried in Egypt? Why am I leaving out? Why does the Midrash need to leave out the main reason? A very obvious reason. Yaakov doesn't want to be buried in Egypt. He wants to be buried in Eretz Israel because that's what every Jew wants to do, because it's the Holy Land. And he's starting to find like some kind of minor reason, the kinim and the thok and everything, all these reasons you can refute those reasons. Right? It's very kalim berikam. You can just say a normal thing. You wanted to be buried in Israel because you want to be buried in Israel. So it says Ramosh a very interesting pshat. It says, Al natik bereni, don't bury me now. What does it mean, don't bury me now? Don't bury me even temporarily in Mitzrayim. Even just for now. Why don't even bury me just for now? For that, there's three reasons. Because otherwise, you could have buried him in Egypt for temporarily and then taken him out in a few hundred years when the Jews leave. just like Yosef did and all the other brothers. So that's why we need to explain that there's a reasons that even a temporary arrangement that wouldn't be good enough for. Even if it's just for now, don't do it. Because of these three things, because that's the three reasons that they're bringing, that this is going to be the reason he doesn't want to be buried in Mitzrayim. So he brings here as well, we'll just mention this by heart, that that there's always an important part of the soul that goes up to Shemayim, and we know that the Avot, all three of the Avot were a Merkava to the Shechina, and they were equally connected, the Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, and as long as the Tiferet isn't there, there's a lack of completion. Yaakov was the Ishtam, he was the Shleimut, right? The Shleimut of the Merkavah is when you have Chesed, Gevurah, and Tiferet, the third pillar. So that's why Yaakov Avinu said, I want you to bury me straight away in Ma'arat HaMachpelah with my fathers. V'shachavti im avotai. I must be buried instantly with my fathers, because my fathers are the other two pillars of the Merkavah, of the Chesed Gevurah, and I need to be there because as long as I'm not there, that's going to prevent the level of Kedusha that exists even regarding Avraham and Yitzchak. So that's why he said he wants to be done straight away. So again, we'll leave it here, Bezrat Hashem, and we should be Zeicha to all the good things, to live in Eretz Israel, to die in Eretz Israel, and Mashiach now. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you guys, everyone that's listening here.